I built this workshop with my own hands, and I'll be damned if a stack of HOA violation letters tells me it's too loud. On a cool North Carolina morning, the scent of sawdust drifts past the foam-lined walls I designed myself. There's a special kind of calm when your door bears a city permit seal framed in steel and you know every screw is exactly where it should be. Inside, my tools rest in order, my coffee steams, and I've got all the proof I need quiet enough to hear my own heartbeat. At 8:05 on a Monday morning, a sharp knock rattled the frame of my workshop door. When I opened it, a young man in a crisp HOA polo stood on the stoop holding a thick envelope like it might stain his hands. He didn't look me in the eye. "I'm just delivering, sir," he mumbled, already stepping back toward the sidewalk. The paper felt heavy before I even knew what was inside. I broke the seal and slid out a notice printed on bright white stock. In bold, at the top, "Violation excessive noise." Below, a blurry photograph of my workshop's back door taken from the alley. Someone had circled the image in red marker as if that turned it into proof. The last page demanded a payment of $750 within 15 days. There was no signature, only the HOA crest and a paragraph about preserving community tranquility. The morning air still carried the cool damp of the mountains mixed with a thread of sawdust and the faint aroma of Miriam's coffee drifting down from the house. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me with a slow push. My workshop is a converted garage walls layered with gypsum mineral wool and channels designed to make even the loudest machine sound like a sigh. I built it in 2017, every detail approved by the city. The letter mentioned resident complaints without a date time or a single decibel reading. That vagueness had Loretta Vance's fingerprints all over it. Loretta, our HOA president, had once called my space a soundproof masterpiece when her microphone died mid-meeting and I'd fixed it with a twist of tape. Back then, she'd smiled at me like we were on the same team. I crossed to the flat file in the corner. The top drawer slid open with the soft resistance of old wood. Inside, rolled blueprints lay in careful order. I pulled the set I knew by heart, Acoustic Treatment and Isolation, Harlan Residence, Asheville, NC. The blue city seal in the corner gleamed under the fluorescent light. Across the sheet in bold letters, the word "Approved" stamped by the city inspector. I unrolled the plans on my workbench, smoothing them with my palms. The details, staggered studs, floating floor insulation specs, were the bones of a room built to keep peace. Outside, a garbage truck shifted gears, the sound dull and far away thanks to those very bones. I rested my hand on the seal for a moment, feeling the faint indentation of the ink through the paper. A fine like this wasn't about decibels. It was about someone deciding they could take a swing at me without getting their hands dirty. I'd seen it before. Small authority flexed in quiet neighborhoods until it grew into something mean. The plans lay open like a chessboard, mid-game, pieces into position, waiting for the next move. I slid the notice beside them, the bold accusation and the city's approval staring each other down. "If they want quiet," I murmured to the empty room, "I'll give them quiet." I capped the blueprint tube, set it by the door, and let the thought settle steady and precise. Not a burst of anger, not a protest shouted into the air, just a move prepared in silence, the kind that changes the whole board before anyone knows the game has shifted. 3 years earlier, I had stood in this same workshop space, staring at bare studs and imagining a shell so perfectly tuned that the outside world would never intrude. The concrete floor was cold under my boots. Sawdust from the demolition still hung in the air, catching the low autumn light like flecks of copper. Outside, red leaves piled against the curb, the wind nudging them into quiet drifts. 2 contractors in worn Carhartt jackets worked their tape measures along the stud lines, calling out numbers in a language I'd learned long ago. Measure twice cut, once, trust the math. Miriam appeared in the doorway, balancing 2 mugs of coffee, one for me and one for the crew. Steam curled around her face before it vanished into the chill. I remember the look she gave me, part curiosity, part faith, that I could turn this cold, echoing box into something worth the trouble. The heart of the plan came from years of knowing how sound behaved when it thought no one was watching. 8-inch double-layered walls with staggered studs, vibration isolation clips, and a floating floor system that sat like a raft on a sea of neoprene. Every joint sealed every gap, treated like a loose string in a finely tuned instrument. Eldon Trask's voice crackled through my phone during one of those early mornings. My old boss, a man who could tell the difference between 60 and 63 decibels without a meter, was the one who signed off on my drawings before I ever sent them to the city. "Build it right the first time, Curtis," he said, "and you'll never have to argue with a fool about how quiet it is." The city inspector came one gray Thursday in November. He wore a knitted cap under his hard hat and carried a clipboard like it was part of his arm. He studied the assemblies, nodded at the double layers, tapped the resilient channels with his pen. When he stamped the top sheet of the plans, the ink bled into the paper, dark and final. Approved. Out of courtesy, I mailed a copy of those stamped plans to the HOA office with a short note for your records. I thought it would save questions later. A month passed in silence. Then, one afternoon, Loretta Vance sent her first email. It was polite enough she wondered if the workshop might have an industrial appearance from the street. I replied in the same polite tone, attached the approved plans, and offered to walk her through the soundproofing. No answer came. A year later, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. This time, the tone was sharper, a violation warning citing unspecified complaints. No dates, no measurements, just the suggestion that my workshop might be incompatible with community standards. I took the letter into the workshop, framed permit still fresh on the wall. The paper felt thin compared to the city seal beside it. Without a word, I pinned the warning next to the permit. 2 documents side by side, one carrying the weight of law, the other just the weight of paper. Every day after, when I walked into that room, my eyes would catch the blue stamp and the pale letter beside it. It was a quiet reminder of where real authority lay and where it didn't. The low hum of my table saw read 52 decibels on the meter, quieter than the garbage truck groaning up the street outside. I jotted the number into my logbook, aligning it neatly under the day's date. The workshop was bathed in the golden spill from my task lamps, each pool of light catching the edges of the tools like they'd been cut from brass. In the top corner of my laptop screen, a notification bloomed from the HOA portal message from Denton Rourke. It was just one line, curious, almost conspiratorial. Do you really think they'll shut you down? Denton lived 3 streets over a quiet type who came to meetings but rarely spoke. The message didn't have a smiley face or a period, just hung there like a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. I clipped another decibel meter to the back corner of the workshop, the one nearest the alley. 2 more went into the front corners, and the last one I placed just outside on the porch railing. Each glowed with a small red light, armed to record every change in sound. I moved slowly, tightening clamps, checking batteries, making sure each device logged both decibels and timestamps. Miriam appeared in the doorway with a sweating glass of iced tea. "You've got them everywhere now," she said, half smiling. I took the glass and let the cold wet my fingers. Every corner, every minute, I told her. She glanced at the laptop, at the neat columns of readings. "Curtis, Don't let this eat you alive." I promised I wouldn't, though the truth was it already had its teeth in me. By late afternoon, I'd matched each reading to an activity-cutting sanding, even just standing still to see what the meters caught from outside. The porch meter spiked once when a motorcycle passed, then settled back. Inside, the highest number of the day was 54, and that came from the planer, a machine softer than my neighbor's lawnmower. I dialed Eldon's number, leaning against the bench. His voice came warm, but clipped like a man who measured his words the same way I measured sound. I told him about the violation, the vague complaint, the data I was collecting. "Bring the readings and the old permit," he said. "Meet me at the diner down the street, the one with the faded red booths." There was a pause before he added quieter, "If they want to fight, we'll give them one in building code." I could hear the faint clink of silverware in the background, the murmur of a TV somewhere over his shoulder. Eldon never raised his voice, but when it lowered, you knew the matter was decided. I shut down the meters one by one, saving the files to a thumb drive. The permit tube waited by the door, its blue painter's tape still snug around the cap. Outside, a pale fog had begun to unroll itself from the ridge curling through the street lamps. I slid the tube onto the passenger seat of my truck. The headlights carved 2 clean tunnels in the mist as I eased into gear. In the rear view, the workshop stood in its pool of light windows, dark meters still faintly blinking like patient witnesses. Eldon spread my blueprints across the diner's Formica table like we were about to plan a moon landing. The paper rolled toward the salt shaker edges, curling from years in storage. A grease stain bloomed across the bottom corner where I'd once set my lunch without thinking. Around us, the morning rush hummed the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of forks against plates, the smell of frying bacon heavy in the air. "Here," he said, flattening one corner with his palm. From his briefcase, he slid a manila envelope across to me. "This is their weak spot." Inside was a printout of an email from the city's chief inspector, dated just last week. The letter confirmed the permit's validity in unambiguous terms. The city's crest sat in the header, the signature sprawled in blue ink at the bottom. "Your soundproofing structure meets all municipal and state requirements and remains approved as constructed." Eldon had even highlighted the line for emphasis. He leaned back and took a measured sip of coffee while I read. Section 47C. State Code, he said after a pause. HOAs can't override pre-approved structures unless there's a safety hazard or a violation of state law. Noise levels aren't enough if you're within compliance, which you are. He pointed with the tip of his pen to the approved stamp on the blueprint. This is not just paper, Curtis, it's leverage. The waitress came by, topping off both our cups without asking. Eldon didn't look up from the plans, but I caught her glancing at the sprawl of blue lines and city seals, maybe wondering if we were designing something grand or just stubborn. I scribbled notes in the margin of my pad, dates, code sections, phrases I could quote later without sounding like I'd memorized them. Eldon's voice stayed low, each word precise. Loretta will double down when she realizes she's cornered. She'll want to turn this into a public matter so she can claim it's about the good of the neighborhood. Don't give her the fight on her terms. So, what do? I asked. Bide your time. Wait for a public forum one she can't control from behind an email thread. And, when it comes, bring your data, your permit, and that email. Let her talk herself into the corner. The bacon smell mingled with the bitter edge of my coffee, grounding me in the moment. For the first time since the fine landed, I felt the shift not a win yet, but the ground beneath me had stopped sliding. Eldon tapped the approved stamp again, slow and deliberate. Remember, this isn't a debate over feelings. This is the law. As I rolled the blueprints back into their tube, my phone buzzed on the table. A new HOA alert lit the screen. Urgent community meeting. August 15th. Attendance strongly encouraged. I met Eldon's eyes. He just smiled faintly as if to say, right on schedule. Miriam was plating roast chicken when the knock came, a careful, almost apologetic tapping at the side door that cut through the smell of rosemary and garlic. She glanced at me over her shoulder. I still had the day's decibel printouts folded into my shirt pocket, edges softened by the heat of my skin. The light above the sink threw a rectangle onto the frosted glass. A silhouette hovered there, long and hesitant, holding something that looked like a folded agenda. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door. Denton Rourke stood on the stoop, collar shiny from nervous fingers, the HOA header peeking from the papers clutched in his palm. He tried on a smile that didn't fit. "Evening, Curtis." I didn't mean to interrupt supper. "You're just in time for it," Miriam said from behind me, the way you offer a chair before you ask questions. In our house, hospitality outruns suspicion by half a step. Denton came in, eyes tracking the plates as if the simple order of a table might steady him. We ate quietly at first. The chicken skin crackled under the knife, the carrots left orange commas on the plate. Miriam keeps a ledger in her head. Groceries, power bill, the little extras that keep a life feeling like life. She set down her fork and asked me, eyes gentle but aimed straight. "If the workshop stays closed, how long do we have before we're dipping into the emergency fund?" 6 months, I said. It was a number I'd already said to myself, but air makes numbers heavier. Denton looked down at his plate as if the number might be there too. He cleared his throat. "That's part of why I came." He unfolded the agenda and smoothed it beside his water glass. "The hall. People are complaining they can't hear at meetings. It's like talking inside a milk jug." I nodded. Parallel walls, hard surfaces, nothing to break reflections. Words go out, hit the back wall, come back, wearing masks. Miriam tilted her head. "Show him," she said, "the way you tell a man to use his hands when his words are getting ahead of him." I pulled a napkin from the holder and drew a quick block plan the hall as a rectangle, a dais at one short end, rows of chairs, flat ceiling. "Right now," I said, shading the walls with my thumb. "Sound leaves, the speaker slaps that wall, then the side walls, then the ceiling. Every slap muddies the next word. We don't need to silence it, we need to tame it." I sketched shallow triangles in the corners, bass traps, then little rectangles along the side walls, absorptive panels, then a dotted cloud over the audience, hanging baffles like a soft ceiling. This, I tapped the napkin, turns marbles rolling on tile into marbles rolling on felt. Denton looked from the napkin to our kitchen. "Could I?" He stood, walked to the tiled mudroom off the side door, and clapped once. The sound ricocheted down the hall and came back a split second later, thinner, like it had lost some blood. He clapped again in the kitchen where rugs and curtains did their quiet work. The clap fell flat, a gentle little puff. His eyebrows went up. "So that's what you'd do to the hall." "That's what I'd propose," I said. Scaled, measured, predictable. Panels on the side walls at ear height. A cloud over the seating traps tucked into the corners where nobody will see them but everyone will hear them. The room stays the room. It just stopped stepping on its own words. Miriam reached for my water glass and took a sip like she'd been the one doing the explaining. How much, she asked, which is our family's way of blessing a plan by making it real. I gave a ballpark figure. Denton winced, then leaned in when I cut the number in half with volunteer labor and smart placement. You'd help with that, I'd consult, I said, glancing at the decibel printouts in my pocket. And I'd bring the same plan I used in the workshop to clear my name. If we do this right, we fix the hall and show I'm operating under standards you can hang your hat on. He tapped the napkin with a clean fingernail, careful not to smudge the graphite. Loretta's been saying the hall needs a signature solution. Something big. Expensive. She likes the kind of project that looks like a project. Good acoustics rarely look like anything I said. They feel like relief. His mouth tugged into something close to a grin. Relief would be nice. Miriam quietly refilled his glass. In the corner, our wall clock ticked an even rhythm, steadying the room. Denton flattened the agenda again, as if it might run if he let it curl. There's a new business slot at the next meeting, he said. I can raise the hall repairs and I don't know has to bring in a consultant. He tried the last word like a key in a lock. That would work, I said, keeping my voice level. I have learned not to sound like a man who needs something even when he does. Okay, he said louder now, as if his courage depended on the volume. I'll do it. I'll propose we address the echo, and I'll ask the board to consider. He glanced at me, a specialist. Say, acoustic engineer, I said. It makes the panels behave better when they think someone is taking them seriously. He laughed, then surprised at himself, and for a moment we were 3 neighbors around a table and not 2 men standing on a cracked line and a woman counting what the crack might cost. He rose to leave, folding the napkin with the care of a wedding invitation and sliding it into the agenda. At the door, he paused eyes on the frosted glass where his shadow had hovered earlier. The night outside pressed its face to the pane. I should tell you something, he said, voice dropping into the quiet between ticks of the clock. Loretta's planning to make an example of you. She thinks if she can humiliate you in front of everyone, nobody else will question a fine again. Miriam's hand found the back of my chair and stayed there warm, like a palm on a fever. I felt the familiar urge to argue the future into behaving. Instead, I reached into my pocket and touched the edges of the printouts. Paper is not armor, but it does well enough if you bring enough of it and stand with your back to a wall you trust. Then, let her schedule the spotlight, I said. Just make sure the microphone works. Denton nodded once, a man committing to a line only he could see, and stepped out into the dark. I watched his shape blur and shrink on the glass until it was only the reflection of our kitchen again, the plates, the herbs gone dull on the cutting board, Miriam's steady eyes. We stood a while longer, listening to the house hold its breath. When Miriam finally spoke, her voice had the patience of a metronome. "You'll bring the numbers," she said. "And the napkin," I said, folding it once more before tucking it into the permit tube by the door. The paper made that small, satisfied sound, 2 plans finding each other. Outside, somewhere beyond the hedge, a neighbor's dog barked at nothing and got the last echo of its own bark back like the world had answered. "Let's see if the room's as ready to listen," I said, and the clock agreed, counting us toward a night that would decide whether quiet could be used to tell the truth. The folding chairs complained in every register as the room filled metal legs, squealing against waxed tile backs, clicking into place a scrape-and-rattle chorus that made people wince and then laugh at themselves for wincing. The projector on the ceiling blinked awake and went out again, a tired eyelid. Someone at the refreshment table pumped the air pot and coaxed a thin stream of burnt coffee into a paper cup. Denton caught my eye from the 3rd row and gave a small nod, now or never. My laptop bag felt heavier than it had any right to, though all it held was paper and a promise. Loretta strode to the dais in a crisp navy suit, her smile stretched tight as a drumhead. She tapped the microphone. It squealed, then submitted. "Good evening, neighbors. Thank you for coming to our meeting on restoring peace and quiet to our community." She advanced to the first slide, restoring peace in a font that wanted to be soothing. The next slide was a photo collage, trash cans askew, a dog barking at the mail truck, a boy with a skateboard. "As you can see," she said, "we've had numerous disturbances." A ripple of non-committal sound passed through the room. She clicked again. An arrow appeared, fat and red, pointing to a grainy image of my back door taken from across the alley. Primary noise. "Source," the caption announced in a tone that didn't allow for conversation. I heard a few sighs. I could feel Miriam stiffen beside me, then decide wisely to put a calm hand on her own knee. Loretta straightened. "We cannot tolerate," I stood. "Madam President," I said, keeping my voice even. "May I have 3 minutes to respond with data?" She started to demur. The script called for her to finish before questions, but a low murmur of assent rolled in from the chairs, the kind of human sound that rearranges a room. Denton half rose, then sat again, letting the neighbors do the work. Loretta's smile slipped a fraction. She gestured at the projector. 3 minutes, she said. Please be brief. I walked to the little table where the HDMI cable lay coiled like a sleeping snake. My hands were steady as I plugged in. The projector shuddered, blinked, and recognized my laptop. The first slide came up 2 simple bars side by side labeled so even a heartbeat could read them. Workshop table. Saw 52 dB and garbage truck curb 68 dB. The numbers sat above their bars like quiet crowns. I didn't say quieter than your dishwasher, though I could have. I didn't say within code by a country mile. I let the bars breathe. This, I said, is my saw under load measured by 2 independent meters. This is your garbage pickup, same hour, same street. My logs have timestamps down to the second. They're available to any neighbor who wants to look. I clicked to a graph thin blue line for the porch meter green for the back corner, neat dots at each reading. The room leaned forward a little the way people do when a voice starts treating them like grown-ups. The next slide was an email excerpt blown up large enough for the back row from Curtis Harlan to HOA Board, date 06/14/08/19. Subject, courtesy copy of city-approved plans. Beneath it, my sentence attached, please find the permit and drawings for the sound isolation structure. Happy to answer questions or demo the room. The slide after that, from HOA Compliance. Date 06/14/08/21. Received. Thank you. Then, for contrast, a later chain from President at. Date 08/03/21/57. Several residents have concerns about an industrial operation. No attachments, no decibels, no specifics. In the lower right corner, the email's timestamps glowed in grayscale little clocks that didn't care about anyone's feelings. I turned one page in my notes and brought up a single line of text on a blank background, HOA bylaws, 4412, authority and limits. The room went quiet in a different way. I clicked, and the clause appeared in short, chewable pieces. The association shall not contravene municipal approvals or building permits duly issued, nor regulate interior improvements not visible from common areas, except where a documented safety hazard exists. I didn't say that means me. I didn't have to. The words had their own legs. They walked across the room and took their seats. Last I said so, there's no confusion about what we're discussing. The blueprint slide filled the screen, my workshop's plan sheet in high-resolution edges a little frayed, a grease pedal in one corner. I'd enlarged the city seal until its ink fibers showed like threads. Approved blue as mountain shadow sat like a seal ring pressed into wax. A couple of folks in the second row exhaled in unison the sound people make when a knot in their shoulder finally gives. Somewhere behind me a chair creaked, then stilled. Eldon rose from the back row, a paper in his hand, and spoke in his speaking-to-rooms voice. Eldon Trask. Building Inspector's Office. Asheville on personal time. A soft laugh relieved the valve. The city reaffirmed Mr. Harlan's permit last week. There is no code violation, no safety hazard, and no authorization for the HOA to override. State law mirrors this. Where pre-approved structures are concerned, HOAs step carefully, or they step into liability. That last word had a temperature. Heads turned toward the board table as if someone had cracked a window behind them. Loretta adjusted her lapel as if something had crawled under it. With respect, she said, this is about the community's peace. Which is why we're here, I said, advancing to the next slide, a simple sketch over a photo of the hall rectangles along the walls, a soft cloud of panels above the seating, small triangles tucked into corners. If we address the hall's echo with targeted treatment, we improve every meeting for every resident. I'm willing to consult at cost. The plan is straightforward. The measurements are predictable, and we can do it with volunteers and still meet national standards. There is a particular sound a room makes when it recognizes a problem in itself. It's not applause. It's not a murmur. It's a hush that isn't empty. It's full of people deciding. An older gentleman in the front row raised his hand. So, you're telling us your shop is quieter than my dishwasher, he said, saving me from saying it. Laughter this time easier. Denton stood not grand, just standing. Motion for a vote of no confidence in the current president, he said, voice level, eyes on the chair. And for the board to consider Mr. Harlan as acoustic consultant for the hall. Loretta opened her mouth closed. It opened it again. Out of order she tried, but the parliamentarian, a woman who had memorized the bylaws a decade ago and never forgave anyone who hadn't shook her head. "It's in order," the woman said, tapping 4412 on the screen with a capped pen like a bell. The room broke into applause that started messy and then found a beat. I didn't bow. I kept my hands on the table and breathed like a man who had just set down a heavy box. Eldon sank back into his chair with the small smile of a teacher watching a class grade itself. Second, someone called from the back. Second, echoed from the side. Denton looked at me then, at the crowd, and raised his hand not high just enough to claim the moment. The parliamentarian lifted a clipboard, clearing her throat for the record. "All in favor," she said. Hands rose. Not all at once, not like a salute, but in clusters here there, then everywhere, fingers unfolding from fists, palms opening to the air as if to say, "We are done with this part." I watched faces change as arms went up, surprise at themselves, relief at the relief, a kind of tired joy. Across the dais, Loretta's smile already strained thinned to a line and then disappeared altogether. She looked smaller than her suit, smaller than the screen behind her, smaller than the word "approved," sitting in its blue ring, quiet and undeniable. The parliamentarian scanned the room, counting lips moving over numbers she trusted more than moods. Denton didn't look back at me again. He didn't need to. The projector fan whirred. Somewhere in the back, the last of the coffee sputtered its death rattle. Opposed, the parliamentarian asked, pen poised. The room held its breath, and the hands that were still rising rose higher. My boots echoed dully on the newly stripped subfloor, a short, tasteful thump that died before it remembered to be a sound. Good sign. The hall looked like a jaw with the enamel pulled bare, studs along the side walls torn carpet rolled like red riverbank ceiling tiles stacked in cautious cubes. Outside, October had gone to work on the maples. Leaves kept slipping past the glass like slow confetti. Denton handed me a clipboard when I came in. A business check from the HOA was paper-clipped to the new contract payment in full-typed where deposit used to sit. I felt the weight of it through the paper as I flipped pages. Midway down, a clause had been inserted and initialed by 2 board members. All prior violations and fines issued to Mr. Curtis Harlan regarding workshop operations are hereby rescinded and expunged. The ink in their initials looked a shade darker than the rest, as if pressed harder than necessary. I didn't smile. I read it twice, then slid the contract back into its plastic sleeve like a photograph I didn't want the light to fade. We started with the panels. Old decorative rectangles that had promised more than they delivered came off the walls with a tired sigh. Behind them, the paint wore sundial rings where sound had been hitting and retreating for years. I ran a stud finder along the gypsum and tapped where the studs lied about being straight. A volunteer crew of neighbors, 3 retirees with sturdy knees, a college kid with a good back, and Denton in a tool belt he'd clearly missed worked in rhythm pry-pass stack. Sweep haul, laugh at the ache before it could settle. Miriam arrived with a cardboard tray of coffees and the first real smile I'd seen on her in weeks. She set a cup by my tape measure and another by the box of isolation clips. "You're in your element," she said, which is the kindest way to tell a man he looks like himself again. I lifted the lid and let the steam run up my face. "So is the room," I said. "It's ready to stop fighting." By noon, we were hanging the new fabric panels, blue-gray rectangles that looked like quiet was a color. We set them at ear height down the wall, spacing them on a grid I could do in my sleep. Base traps slipped into the corners like wedges of shadow. Over the seating area, we lifted the cloud, a soft canopy of baffles, 1 panel at a time, hands up breath, held screws, catching with the small, satisfying sound of a decision clicking into place. Halfway through the day, 2 board members appeared walking the aisle the way people walk a freshly mowed fairway. They spoke in polite whispers, as if the room had become a church without telling anyone. Denton showed them the cost sheet, materials, discounted labor, mostly volunteered rental fees, trimmed by using what the city already owned. One of them tapped a number with his pen and murmured a word I rarely hear at HOA meetings. Reasonable. I took a break by the side door, leaning against the cool jamb. Across the street, Loretta's house had a for sale sign planted at a brave angle in the lawn. The little hanging rider said, pending the letters red and cheerful. A contractor's pickup was out front, bed full of paint cans, and a ladder lying at attention. The wind lifted a tarp and let it fall like a curtain, practicing for a closing night. Back inside, the work found its groove. The last fabric panel fought me for a minute and then surrendered. We rolled fresh carpet over the old path of feet, and the room softened a shade like a voice dropping to tell a secret. Miriam stood at the back and clapped once. The clap went out and sat down. No ghost returned with it. Someone laughed, the relieved kind. At 4, the treasurer arrived with a folder. He checked the invoice against the contract, nodded, and slid the payment in full check across a folding table that we hadn't managed to fold yet. On behalf of the association, he said formal but human thank you. He cleared his throat. And, we're sorry for the missteps. The word missteps tottered a little in the air and then found its balance. I tucked the check away and said nothing that would make it harder for him to keep saying the right things. We ran the first sound test before the sun lost the windows. Denton stood at the dais and read last month's minutes, a punishment that became a pleasure. His voice came out of the speakers and into the seats without turning around to bite itself. Consonants landed where they were sent. Vowels didn't smear. You could hear the commas. At the back row, an older woman cupped a hand to her ear, then let it fall. Clear as the morning news, she said, and then she didn't have to say anything else. The microclimax wasn't a cheer. It was the room forgetting to echo. It was the silence that followed words because they'd done their job and didn't need to hang around. We finished 2 days ahead of schedule. I walked the aisles with a roll of blue tape and left small flags on corners that needed a tenderness only tomorrow could give. The crew drifted toward the door in 2s and 3s, a pleasant kind of tired folding over them like a blanket. Outside, the leaves had started collecting in the gutter. A boy dragged a rake across the sidewalk and made a sound the hall would never make again. As I was packing my drill, Eldon appeared, hands in his jacket pockets, the collar turned up against the evening. He looked up at the baffle cloud, then at the side panels, then at me. "It's honest," he said, which is the closest he comes to praise. He rocked back on his heels. "You should consider taking on a formal role with them. Technical advisor liaison, pick a title. Someone needs to keep the meters honest." His tone made it clear he meant the people as much as the dials. I set the drill in the case and snapped it shut. The latch made a small final click that carried in the new air. Through the door, I could see the contract's rescission clause peeking from its sleeve on the table, initials catching the fluorescent light like 2 small anchors. Maybe I said not to play coy, but because I could feel the weight of yes and the weight of no sitting side by side. Eldon waited the kind of silence that offers room instead of taking it. The hall hummed softly. The HVAC like a cat asleep on a windowsill, and for a moment I let myself listen to what we'd built, not the panels, not the traps, not the cloud, but the behavior of sound when given a better choice. Eldon tilted his head toward the board doors. "Think about it," he said. "Quiet isn't a default. It's a policy." He left me with that, and the room held it for me until I was ready to carry it out into the leaf-sweet dusk. On opening day, a small crowd gathered just inside the hall's glass doors, all of them looking past the coat rack at the new frame on the wall. Winter light poured through the tall windows and hung on the glass like a second pane. The frame was simple maple with a thin bevel, nothing that asked for praise. Inside, matted on cream board, sat the blueprint sheet with its blue city seal and the stamp that had carried us through the storm. Miriam squeezed my hand once and tipped her chin toward the frame the way you point out a bird without scaring it away. Her eyes were easier than they'd been in months. "Looks right there," she said. I nodded because some victories prefer understatement. People drifted toward their seats, testing the air with their voices as if it might answer back. It didn't not anymore. The carpet hushed footsteps. The panel cloud softened the ceiling's old habit of repeating itself. The microphones waited on their stands like tools that had finally learned their job. Eldon stood near the backhands, in his jacket pockets, a man allergic to center stage but pleased with the view from the wings. The MC rapped the lectern gently. No shriek, no feedback, just the tiny wood-on-wood thwack that said we had built something that knew how to listen. "Welcome," she said, and the word reached the far corners of the room without splitting in two. "Thank you for coming to our first community workshop in the improved hall." She glanced at the framed sheet by the door and smiled. "Some of you have asked what that is. It's the blueprint and permit that guided this project. For the record, the city approval number is," she read it cleanly, each digit a bead on a string. The kind of clarity that makes bureaucratic language sound almost ceremonial. Heads turned to look again at the frame, and a murmur rolled through the aisle that felt like closure. Neighbors took turns at the mic. A woman led a Q&A about winterizing pipes. You could hear the consonants in insulation all the way from the back row. A teenager explained a plan for a community garden and didn't have to shout. An older man asked a question about wheelchair access and didn't have to ask it twice. Between speakers, the sound in the room settled like snow falling on a field there, but not intruding. Denton circulated with a clipboard collecting comments, and because he is Denton, telling anyone who asked that the panels were nothing fancy, just smart. A cluster of volunteers compared notes on how easy it had been to hang the corner traps once they'd found the studs. Someone near the windows laughed, and the laughter stayed exactly where it belonged in the faces that made it. Midway through the workshop, the board took a quick vote on housekeeping. The treasurer, who had looked skeptical for the entire duration of her term, cleared her throat and proposed a maintenance fund for the hall, modest recurring fed by the leftover budget from the renovation and a small percentage of rentals. "So we don't wait until things fall apart to fix them," she said. Hands rose around the room, and the motion carried with more ease than I'm used to seeing at these things. That, too, sounded like progress. During a break, an older neighbor sidled up to me, hands in his cardigan pockets, and cocked an ear toward the frame. "Best noise complaint we ever had," he said, and I laughed in spite of myself. He nodded toward the baffle cloud overhead. "You changed the way the room talks to us." I told him the room had done most of the work. We had only given it better choices. Miriam brought me a paper cup of coffee from the refreshment table, and we stood near the aisle shoulder to shoulder, listening to the workshop take its own shape. Eldon passed by and gave the smallest of nods, the kind you return without words. For a moment, I let the whole sequence unwind in my head, the knock at the door. The envelope, the meeting, the vote, the contract clause initialed with reluctant care, and now this, a room that carried words properly. Before everyone left, the MC thanked the volunteers by name and tapped the frame again with the back of her knuckle, a light chime against the glass. "May we always remember," she said, "that paperwork can be a promise when we treat it that way." The room answered with a low hum of agreement, not applause, exactly something steadier. We walked home in the kind of cold that sharpens edges without cutting you. The ridge wore a strip of pale sky like a scarf. You could smell chimney smoke beginning its evening shift. At our driveway, I stopped and looked back across the street at the hall's windows, shining squares stacked against the early dark. Behind the glass, people were still talking in pairs, demonstrating pointing testing the way sound traveled now that it had learned to behave. Later in my workshop, I set my coffee on the bench and ran a hand along the wall where the paint meets the ceiling, that soft seam I've always admired. The decibel meters were quiet in their drawer. The legal pad with the old to-do list had been flipped to a clean page days ago. I shut down the lights one by one until the room held only its own shape. At the door, I turned the key and listened. The latch caught with a soft, practiced click, the sound of a promise kept of peace earned rather than borrowed. I stood there a second longer than necessary, not guarding anything, just enjoying the kind of quiet that doesn't have to prove itself. Then I stepped into the winter air, pulled the door gently until the second click answered the first, and let the evening close behind me like a book put back in its place. That night the hall stood quiet under a pale winter moon, the framed blueprint catching a soft glint through the glass. I thought about how a piece of paper, creased, stamped, and once contested, had become a sign of what we could fix when we chose patience over noise. Sometimes a fight isn't about winning, but about showing there's a better way forward for everyone at the table. Even when trust is cracked, it can be mended into something stronger. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? I'd love to hear your story in the comments, or if you like tales like this, stick around for more.